That won't work. I'm on mute. That won't work. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Energy Markets podcast. It is Tuesday, April the 11th, and we have Brent crude oil. Basically, I'm calling this the week in which Brent crude oil doesn't have a heartbeat. It's a flat line. It's got to $85 a barrel on Brent after the big shock announcement last week by OPEC Plus, and it's just more or less stay there, plus or minus a few cents every day, like it's waiting for a bus. What's the next bus to come along? $85 a barrel. Will that bus be delivered from Washington, D.C., where the IMF and the World Bank are meeting, the outlook there, or will it come from Yemen, where indeed Saudi Arabia and its the sort of counter forces within the war in Yemen, the parties to the war in Yemen, seem to be hammering out a deal that might bring a new dawn there. Let's go to Omar Al Obeidly, Director of Research, Bahrain Center for Strategic International and Energy Studies. Omar, this is our first chance to have you at the table and give us your thoughts on this Saudi-Iran rapprochement, and is it going to deliver its first sort of prize in Yemen?
I wouldn't be too optimistic. I think the linchpin here is China. China's ability to enforce any sort of agreement. And if you look at the history of China's foreign policy, there isn't much cause for optimism there, because first of all, China's not a country that traditionally gets involved in countries beyond its neighborhood, nor does it have a handbook or a playbook for dealing with these issues. And secondly, the range of instruments that China has for influencing are quite restricted to the economic domain. It doesn't have any sort of security or military measures. It doesn't have the diplomatic heft of someone like the US. Of course, it could be that this is the start of something new, and China is going to be a much more active partner. But I think that the history of China's involvement should indicate that there isn't going to be any major intrusion on its part. And then as regards the Houthis and the Iranians, it wouldn't surprise me if something temporary emerged as a sort of an attempt to to draw the Saudi Arabians in, possibly to give them a false sense of security. But in the long term, I don't yet see the crucial preconditions for a stable resolution to the conflict, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of armed people, and there's a lot of conflict regarding what is fair, what is just, what is acceptable to all parties.
Dr. Charles Elinas, CEO, Cyprus Natural Hydrocarbons Company and Senior Fellow at the Global Energy Center at Atlantic Council. Dr. Charles, as mentioned in the introduction, the IMF World Bank spring meetings are taking place in the shadow of high inflation still sticking around and slow growth outlook, even though the World Bank did revise a slight upward global forecast for 2023 from 1.7% growth to 2% for the global average global economy, a slight change, but ultimately we still to be, like the oil price, stuck without any wind between China recovery, a demand recovery, and G7, Europe, US economic outlook weakness. That force seems to just be freezing any movement. Your thoughts?
Yes, I think the oil price has now stabilized around $85 and probably will stay around there for a while yet. But I believe in the longer term, over the year, the trend is upwards. I was just reading earlier on some news that in China, the airlines are now hiring staff because they expect air travel to increase dramatically over the next few months. With air travel in China increasing, obviously oil demand will go up, and with supply becoming tighter and tighter after the voluntary cuts in production, prices will go up. So I believe by the end of the year, there is a good chance that the forecast that the oil price may reach $100 will happen. So there is a fair wind in that direction.
You're still a subscriber to the year of two halves, despite
Yes.
the growing concerns about recession in the US, and all sorts of indicators coming that Q1 earnings expected to be significantly lower, and other indicators. You're still subscribing to the idea that second half will bring that demand growth?
I believe it will happen simply because China is going to grow faster than some people expect. Indications from China are stronger, and China will carry the day at the end of the day as far as oil is concerned. The United States isn't really going to go into serious recession. It's remaining stagnant. There may be some concerns about mild recession, but not serious. As a result, oil demand in the United States will not necessarily go down dramatically, but oil demand in China is going to increase substantially. So on balance, globally, we will see prices going up.
Let's welcome to the table Jose Chalhoub, a political risk and oil analyst consultant at Venergy Global.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. No, what I said is that recession in the United States isn't going to happen, or if it happens, it's going to be mild, and the impact on oil consumption is going to be small. While in China, the recovery is on the way. The indication that they now expect a huge increase in travel is an indication that things are expected to get better. And oil demand in China is going to increase at a time when these voluntary cuts will come into effect, restricting supply. So overall, if we look at the overall picture, I expect oil demand to, on balance, increase and prices to go up. Yes, it's going to be a year of two halves.
Let's go to Venezuela. I get the view from Jose Chalhoub, political risk and oil analyst, consultant of Energy Global in Caracas. Jose, I mean, one of the surprising stories, although on the margins, but can make a difference in a tight market, Venezuela's March oil exports rise quite significantly as more super tankers, Chevron cargoes, are picking up Venezuelan oil. What's your outlook for that?
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Thank you very much. According to recent data, the exports have been rising around 40,000 barrels per day. But that's considering only the Chevron recent license to restart production here. So I wouldn't be too, hopeful on any significant recovery of production, considering all this recent massive case of corruption discovered here in Venezuela, leading to the resignation of former oil minister Tarek Al-Aissami.
Resignation or dismissal?
Well, formally resignation. He resigned, but there's lots of versions running around here. The general opinion here is that it's about a clash of factions within the same government. I'm the one that reads this situation, some sort of pressure from Washington in exchange for this recent renewal of license to Chevron, considering also that Tarek Al-Aissami allegedly has lots of links to Iran. So maybe Washington pressured Caracas in exchange for more, sanctions lifting to Chevron and potentially new further investments in the future to further recover oil production here. Just dismiss, get Aissami out of the game, and we'll, probably get you more investments in here in Venezuela. That's my read of this whole situation, but it's been massive. I mean, it's about $40 billion in stolen money in just one case. I mean, it's a continuation of different cases of corruption all through these recent years.
Omar, coming back to the decision by OPEC Plus last week to cut supply quite significantly from May, over 1 million barrels a day within the sort of OPEC countries, Iraq, Saudi, UAE, and Oman, the Gulf countries, and then the Russian cut that's already been in place. There's been some discussion as to whether that was a strategic geopolitical decision in which to sort of re-emphasize the independence, the growing independence of the geopolitical strategy of the Gulf states versus their traditional allies in the West and the US, or it's simply a market outlook that, unlike Dr. Charles, OPEC Plus sees a drop-off in demand, and so they're getting out ahead of it. How do you see that debate?
Yeah, I mean, this is a regular regular occurrence whereby the perception in media circles is that this is some sort of geopolitical message that the Saudis are telling the US we're on our, we're independent. But I don't buy any of this. OPEC decisions, as far as I can tell, certainly since 2016, are driven 99.9% by economic considerations. And I think that there's two factors that play in here. First of all, OPEC is more pessimistic than Charles are regarding the state of the economy in the second half, especially because inflation is still being stubborn. And so perhaps expectations of interest rate cuts, or at least of the absence of further interest rate increases, are not going to be realized. And so they're hedging on that. And secondly, I think Saudi Arabia wants to create some excess capacity in its own production, so that, as we lead up to more sensitive political times in the US electoral calendar, Saudi Arabia has the weapon, or if you call it the tool, of being able to increase supply quite easily if there is a spike in prices, either because of an escalation in conflict in the Middle East, escalation of conflict in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. But overall, I think it is just a garden variety economic decision by OPEC, and all the sort of hair on fire geopolitical analysis is just mostly wide of the mark.
Charles, just sort of picking up on that. I mean, can both of these things exist where it's a market analysis, a market decision as OPEC Plus and Saudi Arabia in particular as the leader has always declared in recent times, they make decisions based on the balancing of the market. And yet how can that be a judgment in place when you're saying and echoing what the IEA has been saying for some time, that the second half of the year will bring a significant surge in demand recovery, bringing the global average for the year of 2023 above 2 million barrels a day. That would mean that in the second half, we'd have to see a 2.6, a 2.7 million barrel a day demand increase over 2022 in order for those numbers to be achieved. Clearly, OPEC Plus doesn't see that.
But I think you have to look at it in a slightly different way. We started the year with a oil price of about the first quarter of about $85, and forecasts that by the end of the year it will go to 100. Then we had the banking crisis, and the price collapsed. And even though it recovered, it didn't recover substantially. Saudi, as we know, has a target.
Well, it's come back to where it was before the banking crisis.
No, hang on. It came to about $80, and it's stuck there for a little while. Saudi has a target to maintain an oil price around $90. So they brought in these voluntary cuts, and hey presto, the price rose back. It came back to the levels before the banking crisis, to about $85. And they announced it in a way to get maximum impact. In other words, to cause a substantial increase in price by coming out unexpectedly. So OPEC, in my view, OPEC merely acted on market forces. They saw the price coming down, staying down and not bouncing back, looking into the future and getting a little bit worried about how things are going to go, and acting on that basis. Nothing geopolitical about it. It's merely OPEC acting on, especially Saudi, on its own targets and trying to bring the oil price back to that level. And it has had the desired effect. So why are we, what I find funny is that analysts immediately during the banking crisis, immediately projected into prices into the future, low prices, and all sorts of things, and forecasting price of oil by the end of the year much lower. And suddenly now, because of these cuts, they change their approach. So I think there is a misreading of the situation.
Well, everybody's changing their approach. A few weeks ago, OPEC Plus said they weren't going to do anything until the end of the year. They obviously did a major announcement. Now, whether they follow through with it to the letter of the law, we'll have to see. But ultimately, there's a lot of change and counterintuitive forces moving. And you'd have to say, for 1.5 million barrel a day cut, only getting back to where you were a month ago isn't exactly a confidence boosting and results, you would say.
But I believe OPEC was trying to achieve just that, to come back to where they were. They were not necessarily trying to drive the price to very high levels. That's not the aim. They have achieved what they wanted, I believe, and they responded simply because they had to. The price went down and wasn't coming up, and there was a danger that having stuck to around 80 or below 80, it would stay there. So they notched it up, and they acted the way they, in my view, the way they should be expected to act.
Jose, you mentioned in your earlier comment there that there is this underlying sort of quid pro quo discussions going on between Washington and Caracas, the removal of the former energy minister, the corruption investigation. Do you the sort of re-engagement of Chevron? Is this a path now that's going to deliver more results for the Venezuelan oil industry, for Venezuelan oil exports? Are you optimistic that Caracas and Washington can find a working relationship?
I should be. I should expect that. I mean, I'm the one that ever since this whole mess, started, when this former minister just resigned or was sacked. I mean, you know, just connected the dots, and Venezuela and the U.S. I've always insisted on this. I mean, they were both traditional commercial allies. I mean, because of the geographical proximity between Venezuela and the US. I mean, for Venezuela, the only way to recover entirely its oil production, because the government, the state needs fresh oil money, fresh investments. The only way, considering also the situation regarding Russia, the sanctions against Russia, like the sanctions against the Russian oil exports, the only way for Venezuela to get fresh money is to relaunch its relationship, being more pragmatic with Washington. And I consider this whole situation based on the fact that Aissami, the former minister, according to lots of versions, had different links with Iran, with different Arab extremist groups in Syria and Lebanon. I think there was a an exchange between Washington and Caracas for more investments. That's what I believe. I mean, recently also I read that the Valero refiner company was considering to apply for a new license to import crude from Venezuela. So I mean, you see this, you can connect the dots after all this thing that happened regarding the minister, the corruption case. I mean, it's been massive. And I think that maybe Maduro and his allies, his close allies, were pushed by Washington to clean up this whole mess of corruption in exchange for more investments. That's my read since the the very beginning of this whole situation.
Let's go to the survey question, because another sort of exciting, confusing signal in all of this is the performance of Bitcoin. The Bitcoin has just surpassed $30,000 in trading, and if we can bring up the survey question, the outlook for the Bitcoin for the first time since June, and the question is why Bitcoin is a reference for risk-on bulls. It's generally been the indicator in the past that Bitcoin moving above 30,000 is an indicator of risk-on appetite, so is it because the risk-on appetite, the bulls are back? Or is Bitcoin now a flight to safety? Indeed, with all the troubles in the dollar and the uncertainty with the sort of US financial system, the European financial system, that actually Bitcoin is going above $30,000 because it is now a flight to safety for bears on the traditional financial system. Or is it simply business as usual, confusion reigns supreme, this is the moment we're in? So risk on bulls, flight to safety bears, or confusion continues? Your thoughts on that from a Bitcoin point of view, and where this risk on appetite may indeed be. Omar, I wanted to get your views on the wider geopolitical situation in the region. Saudi, Iran, we've got your views. You've always been somewhat sort of a little bit questioning the sustainability of that. But what about the wider region? We're seeing some significant sort of troubles emerging within the Syrian-Israeli border, Lebanon. Are these related? Is that totally isolated? We did have a sense that Saudi, the Abraham Accords, were bringing the Gulf and the Israel closer together vis-a-vis Iran. Is this now some kind of sunlight between them? How do you see the whole picture of the region in the context of the Saudi-Iran rapprochement?
Well, this is a timely reminder that Iran has a very sophisticated network of proxies and has significant influence over those proxies, and strategically and tactically instructs them to escalate depending on its, its position in certain negotiations. So at the moment, there's still question marks over the Iranian nuclear deal. So as Iran is courting Saudi Arabia, it sends a reminder to the US and Israel that it can still continue to threaten their own interests as it seeks to get as good a possible offer from the US regarding a nuclear deal, assuming that's still on the table. And it's also, an indication of the endemic problem we have in the region, which is that many countries, many states, and many groups, non-state groups and state groups, and so on, are unsatisfied with their current lot in life and feel that the best way for them to improve their lot is to take things by force. And that situation hasn't changed, and is going to get worse, I'm afraid, for the foreseeable future. For a while, we had the US acting as a policeman from, say 1990 till about 2010. But it's quite clear that the US has taken its hands off the wheel and is not interested in being a policeman. And so now it's looking like 19th century power politics in the Middle East, whereby everyone who thinks they can get something by force just takes it by force. And I'm afraid we won't see an improvement on that front. And you mentioned that I temper, that I'm relatively pessimistic. I am pessimistic. In particular, I don't think the situation, this chronic instability in the Middle East, unfortunately, will be resolved until there's a big war. That's what I think is we're heading towards. There's going to have to be some sort of big, head-on, clear, explicit conflict, and 2 or 3 major players are going to have to be, knocked down a few pegs, and only then can we really think about something stability. But until then it's just whatever we saw in Europe for 200 or 300 years, microcosmically being recreated in the Middle East.
Well, Charles, I'd like you to pick up on that from a European perspective. We've just seen the culmination of 3 days of rather robust military exercises around Taiwan, immediately after a visit by Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and Ursula von der Leyen, the EU president, to China, which we're sort of signaling some gap between the European position on China and the US position on China. I wanted to get your views on that discussion, that sort of analysis after this visit of Macron and Ursula von der Leyen to China. Is there a gap emerging between Washington and Brussels vis-a-vis China? And where does that go?
There certainly is. If you see Macron's actions in China, what he said, what he did, and then if you see what Germany has been doing, reluctantly following the United States, but not really endorsing the United States position, there is a division growing between European countries and the United States. The European Commission, though, is fully behind the United States. But the European Commission, on its own, it's not sufficient to sway the whole of Europe behind the American line. So with the French and the Germans taking a slightly different view and trying to maintain some kind of independence and safeguard their economic interests, there is a division growing. There is a growing belief that China is not as dangerous as is made out by the United States to be. It still is way behind the United States in terms of military strength or an economic strength. And as a result, the Europeans see benefit in maintaining a slightly different line of approach towards China than Europe, than the United States.
How do they sort of sleep at night with sort of reconciling that view with the fact that China is essentially giving Russia the cover it needs geopolitically to maintain a war in the center of Europe? How do they square that circle?
I believe ultimately Germany and France would like to see an end to the Ukraine war in the not too distant future, and perhaps they see China as coming in and offering some help in that direction. Certainly, they don't believe the United States at this stage is interested in bringing the war to an end. and the war, as things are at the moment, is just carrying on, unbelievably carrying on. There is unease within Europe about the impact of the war. It's having a huge impact. Europe is becoming deindustrialized as a result of the impact of the war on energy, on costs, and there is also a concern that Europe is turning into a United States satellite. If they're not careful, if Europe is not careful to take a position and exert itself, it will find itself as a satellite to the United States. And that's not a vision that Germany and France share.
Well, perhaps they should start spending their 2% of GDP on defense if they want that independent view of the world. It seems a little bit, I don't know how that gets balanced out, but let's get the survey result and go to South America for the South American view. So the view in this room, and we'll post on social, is that interesting that there's a certain number of subscribers to seeing Bitcoin as a flight to safety. That was my vote personally. I'm starting to see Bitcoin as a flight to safety away from the dollar and the financial system of Wall Street, and perhaps, but let's see what social media we post that there. Jose, I wanted to get your views on where is South America vis-a-vis this point of aligning with China or not. We will see President Lula go to Brazil, or go to China today. Of course, the biggest economy and country in South America and Latin America, and we saw last week or the week before Honduras sort of take a strong stand along with China against rejecting Taiwan. Where does Lula go in his visit to to China vis-a-vis separating a viewpoint on China versus Washington?
Yeah, sure. You have to consider also the recent news about Brazil and China starting, first steps in doing exchange in Chinese yuan with the renminbi. So yeah, it's pretty much interesting, but for me, it's a very different kind of influence that China and Russia, in this case, have in South America. Unlike the one that it had during the former period when Chavez was alive, for example, when you had the first terms of Lula, considering all the macroeconomic situation and condition of the region. I mean, it's not pretty much the same situation as before. You have different turbulent times in terms of price of commodities. There is not a clear political landscape as well in South America. Recently, we saw news about the Exxon dumping some projects in Brazil because of the inability. We have Guyana. Guyana is the new kid on the block, also in terms of oil production. You have the case of Colombia and Gustavo Petro still finding huge opposition in terms of oil projects, and his very known stands against new oil projects. So it's going to be a new kind of not so easy Chinese and Russian influence in the region. Lula still has some important problems to solve here and in Brazil as well. So it's going to be a new and different stage for it's not going to be easy for China and Russia to easily penetrate the region as they did before.
Interesting. Well, some very big geopolitics at play, no doubt, across the world. But at the moment, the oil market is yawning at all of that and not really too concerned. With Brent trading up this morning in Asia, nearly 1%, but still not quite getting across the $85 level on Brent. It seems to be a bit of a ceiling at the moment, at least until we get some new direction. But Bitcoin, however, seems to have found its direction, and it's had a steady climb over the last month or more, above from low $20,000 to above 30 now. Interesting to understand the why why of that? Is it optimistic outlook or is it concern? What is feeding the oxygen of Bitcoin? Thank you so much. As always, great to have Dr. Charles Elinas, Omar El-Baidly, and Jose Shalhoub. Thank you for your insights and commentary this morning on the direction of travel for the energy markets. We will wait to see how the week plays out. We're here every morning, 10:30 UAE time. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, all the best.